but does anyone really want to watch me make a green frog with progressively fancier garlic bulbs on top? Hey folks, my name is Adam and I like to make tiny nerdy things, and I'm nothing if not frustratingly susceptible to peer pressure, so here we are, and here I am, making a series of frogs with progressively fancier garlic bulbs on top. Or rather, I guess we're taking a series of frogs and making progressively less fancy bulbs, since I'm starting with Venusaur in order to better approximate the size of the smaller evolutions. Now, knowing my propensity for grossly underestimating scale, I knew that if I started with the Bulbasaur and worked my way up, then Venusaur would likely end up being only slightly smaller than a common house cat. That being said, Venusaur is a pretty chunky boy to begin with, which is why I'm spending an awful lot of time making sure his leg rolls are looking extra thick. I also really wanted to give him a bit of action in his pose, but he's an oversized stumpy-legged toad with a colorful palm tree sprouting out his spine, which means I didn't have a whole lot of room in terms of movement, so I made him lean ever so slightly to the side. Then once I've inserted a trio of claws into claw-appropriate divots, I can get to adding the plethora of warty protuberances that adorn this soon-to-be blue beauty. I'll drill a couple holes in the front of the body so that I can stick a couple wires in place so I can stick the upper half of his head on said wires. And once I've blended that into the body, I can add his bottom jaw, give him a stiff upper lip, and then thicken up his formidable brow. Then an oversized lump of clay gets stuffed in his mouth to act as his tongue, and I can add a couple of ears. I've pre-baked a set of teeth that get stuck all up into his gums, then I'll use a circle cutter to carve out his eyes, round them out, add some bags underneath, and some overly dramatic eyebrows, and he's ready to be painted. Yeah, you heard that right, he's already getting painted. I know it's going to be a real pain in the ass trying to get to his body once I've got his big palm fronds in place, so before I do anything else, I want to at least get his body painted blue. I've done this a few times before, and people have asked if it's okay to paint and continue adding clay after, and it most certainly is. Probably. I mean, why wouldn't it be? I don't know, I've never had any issues, and if you can't trust a random faceless stranger on the internet, then who can you trust? Otherwise, once the paint's dried, I'll drill 4 equal matching holes in his back so I can stick 4 equal lengths of wire in. These will be the stems and supports for the palm fronds, so I'll bend them into appropriately palm frondy shapes. To make the leaves, I've rolled out a fairly thin sheet of clay, which I'll lay out on a plastic bag, then cut into a more leafy shape. By making it on the plastic bag, I can add a bit of surface detail without worrying about pressing the clay into the mat and then ripping it up when I peel it off. Then I can press it into place on my pre-made stem wires, press it down in the middle, then go about making it look a little less flat before adding the other 3 leaves. Now you won't see the undersides, but I'm also making a bit of green clay underneath to cover up any of the exposed wire. Finally, once they've been baked in the oven, to lock them in place, I'll paint them in a few varying shades of greens, blending lighter colors from the center out before hitting all the edges with a very light green dry brush. I also figured it made sense to finish the rest of the painting since it'll only get more unwieldy as I add the taller sections of the tree, so I made sure to paint his mouth, tongue, teeth, toes, and eyes before moving on. As always, I'll spend a little bit more time making sure the eyes look right, and then I'll give them a thin coat of UV resin, but only once I've finished everything else since UV resin in the oven aren't generally compatible. Otherwise, with all the painting out of the way, it's time to get started on that aforementioned tree. Now, I'm no botanist, and the leaves leave me a little confused, but I'm pretty sure that this chunky blue boy is sporting a palm tree on his back, so that's what I'm gonna make. To make said palm tree, I've rolled out a cocktail sausage's worth of brown clay, then layered on a few spiky strips facing upwards. A few tweaks later, and I can jam this onto his back. Once it's been baked, it gets a touch-up coat of various brown highlights before moving on to the big pink palm fronds. These are pink, and I don't have pink clay. I do, however, have red and white clay. Now with my newly created color, I can squish out a flat sheet of pink clay, then using a perfectly sized plastic soup cup, I can get to making the tops of the tree. I'll start by cutting out 6 roughly equally sized wedges, then chopping out the center so that it should fit on the tree. Then I'll work my way around the edge, adding little nicks and cuts to the tips before removing a little bit of width from each of the leaves. Then I'll peel these off the sheet and drape them over a rolling pin and then blast them with a heat gun before throwing them into the oven to cure. I'll give the edges a nice light pink highlight, then paint on all those little white shapes. Finally, these get glued in place around the top of the tree, and I can finish it off by crowning this sculpture the goodest blue boy ever. Which means we're 1 down and 2 to go. Both Bulbasaur and Ivysaur will be birthed from the same gray clay zygote, but with a slightly off-center separation, leading to one being ever so slightly larger. I'll start with the smaller of the two, which is, of course, Bulbasaur. Now I've squeezed a little ball of clay onto a slightly less little oval that is his body, then carved some lines into it so that I'm left with a slightly wrinkly looking peanut. Then a quick Joker-inspired smile, a reshaping of the lips, and I can give him a big adorable set of eyes. Then I'll poke a couple quick breathing holes into the front, slap on some ears, then add some big chonky sausage legs. Then I'll reshape and wrinkle them up until they look like overstuffed yoga pants doing downward facing dog, then stick his own set of teeny tiny talons into his toes. Then it's into the oven with him, and I can give him his trademark greenish blue hue. Or rather, I can struggle to get the color right and give him his trademark whatever the hell this color is. I don't know, mixing colors is my kryptonite. Fortunately, once the paint had dried, I'd added his plethora of little colored shapes, and he wasn't just looking good, he was looking good enough. Which means I could paint his eyes, and given that his eyes take up roughly 35% of his face, I think as long as they look good, I can get away with a lot when it comes to his body color. Now to make his vines, I've double wound the smallest wire I have, then rolled out an extra long, extra thin green wormy dealy, which I then wound around the tiny aluminium helix. Once all the wire was covered, I drilled a couple holes into Bulbasaur's back, stuck the vines in, and then bent them into shape. Of course, what's a Bulbasaur without his bulb? To make the bulb, I've rolled out a little ball of green clay, then pinched the tip so it's slightly bulbous before using a blade to cut straight lines across the top of the bulb to make each of the sections. Then I'll press those sharp lines in with a soft silicone shaper to soften the curve, carve out the section of the top where the bulb is opening, bend the bulb tips back before finally attaching it to Bulbasaur's back. Last but not least, I'll top the tips of the whips with pink clay, then cover said pink tips with light green leaves before finally moving on to Ivysaur. Now Ivysaur, as much as I love him, really is the perfect in-between evolution of Bulbasaur and Venusaur, which is great since it fits the frog with the garlic turning into a toad carrying a tree on his back motif to a T. However, when it comes to adding interesting commentary and breaking down the intricacies of the sculpture, let's face it, you just watch me make a bigger version of him, followed by a smaller version of him. Unless you skip to this part, in which case, shame on you. However, if you did just show up, then oh boy, have I got something to show you. First off, I made an oddly shaped peanut, then gave it a mouth, some teeth, some eyes, some ears, and attached 4 tiny sausage limbs, complete with teeny tiny toe talons, before eventually painting the entire thing blue. Which leads us to where we are now, and that is adding another layer of blue in order to get the original blue to a slightly more Ivysaur blue. Once I've got the blue body I want, I'll add some more blue in the form of little triangles and diamonds scattered haphazardly around his body before painting his mouth red, his tongue pink, and his teeth white. Then I can finally focus all my love and attention on giving him those big, adorable Ivysaur eyes. Then, same as we've done for the Venusaur before him, I'll drill 4 little holes in his back so I can stick some wire in place to mount my leaves, which, now that I think about it, given that Ivysaur is Ivysaur, and ivy that makes you soar is poison ivy, and Ivysaur is a poison Pokemon, this really ought to be poison ivy leaves. But instead, we're gonna go with poison ferns, I guess. To make Poison Fern's blooming garlic bulb, I'll use the same pink I made the coconut toad's palm fronds out of, rolling it into a shape similar to the garlic frog's bulb, but this time, to make it a little bit more flower-like, I'm going to swirl the center and add some petals. Then I'll add a tiny baby tree trunk to the center of my poison fern fronds before jamming the pink garlic bulb in place. Finally, I'll wrap the bulb in a little green clay to join the bulb in the brown base, and then it's on to making the actual base. Now, up until this point, I really didn't have any idea how I was going to make the base, but I knew it needed to be thematic to our trio of garlic toads. The problem, though, was that while the Chad lizard had an obvious fire-themed base, and the cannon tortoise had an obvious water-themed base, making something that was appropriately garlicky turned out to be a bit trickier than I had hoped. Eventually, though, I settled on the most recurring theme that I could think of: vines. Now, I figured vines are a pretty important part of the Bulbasaur evolution, and they tend to whip those things around all willy-nilly, and I want to get in on that action. Of course, there's no way that I could get the big chunky blue tree toad to bounce on some little vines, so I'm going to have to make them a proper base. And I thought, maybe instead of a vine, why not make it a tree trunk? Which leads us to what you're looking at now, which is me suddenly deciding to make whatever it is I was making into a tree by adding little limbs around the bottom of the base. Now, I often talk about how I don't have much of a plan going into these things, and while that's generally true, I think this takes the cake as far as the old "I have no idea what I'm going to do" approach goes, and I think it ends up being one of my favorites. By rolling the ball stylus randomly along the surface of the clay in one direction, I was able to add a pretty convincing looking bark texture, and then by rolling concentric circles in the bottom section, I was able to get a pretty great looking tree stump. I made a few choice cuts here and there to add a little bit of texture to the bark, but I decided against going heavy-handed in the detail since I think the softer texture matches the Pokemon style a little bit better. Then the whole thing gets a once-over with a dark brown followed by random splotches of lighter browns to add a bit of variation. Then I painted the center of the stump as well as all the little broken branches with a much lighter khaki color before giving everything a few different dry brushes to highlight some of the edges. Looking at it now, I kinda wish I'd given the whole thing a once-over with a matte varnish though, since it's kinda sweaty looking. Now, Venusaur will be standing on the bottom and Ivysaur will be jumping off the end of the branch, but I needed somewhere to put Bulbasaur, so I drilled a couple of holes and made a few Bulbasaur-sized leaves to stick out of the branches. Then I rolled out a couple extra long, extra wormy dealies and wrapped them around the tree, acting as even more vines. Then I added little green leaves to the vines, and to break up the brown of the stump, I added a bit of choice weeds sticking out of the cracks, as well as a few white blobs of clay that will be my conchs. Finally, because it was a little two-toned, I added some little pink flowers with the leftover clay. Then once everything had been baked and locked in place, I gave all the green parts a slew of green highlights and dry brushes. I painted my conchs with a beige top, then painted my mushrooms red before finally putting my trio in place. Otherwise, with all three where they need to be, we're on to the glamour shots. As always, a huge thank you to the support of those on Patreon who help keep this channel churning out weekly videos for your consumption. And of course, a huge shout out to my newest patrons: Amaryllis, Saren500, Nina Iglinski, Mike Yencha, Haruka Saito, Alyssa Heron, King of the Mushan, Luke Carey, The Lapis Lagomorph, Adrian Sato, Lost Her Sheep, Red Dragon, Lydia M, Kevin Kirk Haley, and Rich FX. It's your help that's turning this little frog of a channel into a terrifying, wordy, tree-carrying toad. If you'd like to help out, then do all the usual things.
Smash like and subscribe.
Otherwise, we'll see you next time. Cheers.